So this morning, the theme of our camp, for all of our camps this summer, for the camps that we have hosted, has been in-game. And if you guys have watched the Avengers movies, there's a point in Infinity Wars where Doctor Strange is like, there's only one way this is going to turn out. And then from that point on, he has put into place, into motion, these things that will finish the game. And so what we're doing in our summer camps this summer is we want to give our students the things that they need to make it to the end. In fact, our theme verse this summer is Colossians 3:2. And it says basically this, that we turn our attention not on the things right now and right here, but we put our attention, our focus, our efforts, everything that we do into what's coming next, into eternity, into the kingdom of God that we are going to be stepping into when this world is done, when our time is done here. And so we want to, our heart in student ministries and in our children's ministry is to raise up young people that have the things, the tools that they need to make it to the end of this game. And Paul says, look, I run in such a way to make it to the end. I'm not doing a sprint. I'm doing the marathon. I'm going to make it to the end. I'm not going to fizzle out, but I'm going to keep going. And so one thing that you need to make it to the end of a race is endurance. Can anybody tell me what endurance is? This is where you guys get to talk. I do student ministries. I need people. Listen, I'm running on little sleep, so you guys got to talk to me, or we're both going to fall asleep, and then we'll get done at like 5 o'clock today. So what's endurance? What does endurance mean? Long-lasting. Billy, keep going. What's that? Strength. So as I was preparing for the message, I was like, well, I wonder what endurance means and what it means to endure. And so I looked it up in the dictionary, and this is what it means. It means to remain patient in suffering. To remain patient in suffering. When I was in high school, I did football, and we had 2-a-day sessions in August in Illinois, and it was not as hot here, but it was hot. That was suffering to me. Two practices a day in full pads in 100-degree temperature, that was suffering to me. But that suffering allowed us to get to the end of the game. And without that suffering, we would have fizzled out in the first quarter. Same thing for runners. They run in training longer than they're going to run in the race so that they can make it to the end without getting tired, without growing weak, and without stopping. And so this morning, we're going to look at the story of Joseph, one of my favorite stories in the Bible, and we're going to look at and see in his life how God used suffering, used a situation that was crazy to produce endurance in his life. And so you find the story of Joseph starting in Genesis chapter 37, and I'm going to kind of paraphrase, sum up some of this story. Otherwise, we'll be here till 2, and Brennan said I had to get done because he was hungry. See, he's nodding. And so Joseph is one son of a guy named Jacob. Jacob had 12 sons from 4 different wives. How many of you know that's a problem starting right there? 4 wives. My wife keeps telling me I don't need any more because she's enough. And I agree. I don't need any more. I don't need any more. I don't know how he did it. He had 2 wives and 2 concubines, and from then he had 12 sons. So the family dynamics is kind of messed up to begin with. And to make it worse, Jacob picked a favorite. Joseph. And he told everybody that Joseph was his favorite. Now, I've got 5 kids. I know that seems like 12, but it's not. It's 5. And our littlest is 2, almost 3. And I tell my kids, I tell my family, he's my favorite. And I do that, and it sounds bad, but everybody says the same thing. He's all of our favorites, so I'm not any different than the rest of my family. He's our favorite because he's goofy. He smiles with his eyebrows and says yes with his eyebrows. I don't know how he does that, but he nods and moves his eyebrows at the same time, and you're like, yes. But we love him, and part of the reason why we love him is because we lost 2 babies before him, and we all prayed for him. Their suffering brought endurance. And so he's our favorite because we endured through to get to the promise of God. And so as we look at Joseph, we're going to see that same thing. How endurance got him to the promise that God had for him. And so Jacob has Joseph. He's got 11 other sons. Joseph's got 11 brothers. Jacob walks around telling everybody that Joseph is his favorite. And it doesn't just stop there. Joseph has made this really fancy robe or coat. And the word in Hebrew is also used for a king's robe. And so Jacob, what he does is Joseph is not the oldest. He's down the line very far. But he takes and gets him this king's robe and puts it on him, letting his brothers know that Joseph is the chosen one. That when time comes for Jacob to pass things on, he's going to pass it on to Joseph, basically passing over all of Joseph's older brothers and giving him the wealth of the family, giving him the power of the family, and everybody else gets to fall in line. Again, not a very great family dynamic. And then it gets worse. If that wasn't bad enough, it gets worse. And Joseph has a dream. And his dream is that him and his brothers are out in the field and they're they're harvesting grain, and they all harvest, they all make sheaves of grain, basically big piles of wheat that they wrap up, and they lay them down, and Joseph's sheath of grain stood up, and the others bowed down to him. And that's fine, but then Joseph has the bright idea to go talk to his brothers about his dream. Now imagine, for those of you who have brothers and sisters, those of you who are older brothers and sisters, you're already thinking your younger siblings are kind of punks, and, it would have been fine if mom and dad stopped at you, right? So Joseph comes up to his brothers and says, hey guys, you got to hear about this dream I had last night. And so he tells them, listen, guys, God gave me this dream, and basically I'm going to sum it up for you. You guys are all going to bow down to me at some point. I'm going to be in charge. I mean, it's already been foretold. Dad gave me the coats. I might as well be in charge right now. I imagine that did not go well in that moment. I imagine things were probably thrown at him. I don't know, that's not in the Bible. You're not going to see that in there. I'm just summing it up from what I've seen of sibling rivalry and relationships of in my family, that's not going to fly. And it says in this moment, and it doesn't just happen once, it happens a second time. Joseph has another dream where 11 stars and sun and moon signifying his brothers and his mom and dad are going to bow down to him. And even his dad's like, whoa, son, you need to know your place. And so Joseph, in an attempt to get what God is promising him, takes matters in his own hands and makes sure that his brothers and his mom and dad know that he's going to be in charge. When we don't have the patience to endure the things that God is putting us in, it can lead to arrogance, and it can lead us stepping out of God's will to make things happen on our own. Sometimes we find ourselves in situations that we want out of so bad that we're not going to wait on God to help us out. We're going to take matters in our own hands. And I know from my own life that usually ends up in a bigger mess than when I started. And we're going to see that kind of happens to Joseph. The Bible talks about from that moment, like his brothers already didn't really like Joseph that much because he was the favorite, he was the tattletale. It said that Joseph would go and watch his brothers and then go back and report to dad and say, hey, dad, Simeon did this today, Reuben did this, Judah, he's just a whole hot mess. And the Bible said they actually hated him so much that at one point they're going to kill him. That's a messed up family situation. And so what happens is Joseph's brothers are off tending the flocks. They had massive herds, and so they're off tending the flocks, moving them from place to place, allowing them to graze. And Jacob gets Joseph and says, hey, why don't you go check on your brothers? Go spy on your brothers. Come back. Tell me if they're doing a good job or not. Tell me if they're slacking off. Tell me if they're sleeping in the middle of the day when they're supposed to be watching the sheep. And Joseph's like, absolutely, I would be happy to do that. How many? That was you as a kid. You're like, I will absolutely go tell my brother and sister. What do I get out of it, mom and dad? And Joseph said, I'm ready to go. So Joseph puts on his king robe, his favorite robe, the robe that marked him as his dad's favorite, and heads off to his brothers a ways away from mom and dad. And the Bible says that his brothers saw Joseph coming, and they planned in their hearts to murder him. Getting outside of God's timeline can put us into a situation where we make other people angry at us. Joseph was at a point he was almost willing to do anything to get to that promise, even if it hurt others. And so Joseph shows up, they grab him, they throw him into a well, and then they're having a committee meeting on what they're going to do with him. The first intent was to murder him, and then somebody's like, that might not be the best idea. I mean, he is our brother. That's kind of extreme, right? Well, God in his providence brings along a band of Ishmaelite traders that are making their way to Egypt to trade. And so somebody has the bright idea of like, hey, let's make some money off the dude and sell him to these Ishmaelite traders. And then we don't have his blood on our hands and we make a little money while we're doing it. Great idea, right? Some of you, again, would have done that with your brothers and sisters. If somebody came along and was like, hey, how much for your brother? Give me $5 and we're good. Some of you would have held out for like a Whataburger meal or something like that, but most of us, it wouldn't have taken much. And so they sell their brother to be a slave. Now, like I said, the story of Joseph has always been one that has fascinated me. And for the last several years, I've been wrestling with this idea that if to get to the promise that God had for me, if I had to become a slave, would I do it? Would I willingly submit myself to be a slave, having no rights, no property, being told where to go and what to do? Would I do it? And I don't know that I would. If I'm just honest, I don't know that I would. I mean, Joseph didn't have a choice in this moment. He had to go no matter what. It's either death or a slave. I think I would have chosen the slave at that point. And so he is shipped off to Egypt. He's taken away. He loses his position as the favorite son. He loses the nice things that he has. He loses his home. He loses his identity. All of that's stripped away. And he is taken to Egypt to become a slave in somebody's house that don't know him, that don't know his people, that don't know their customs. Joseph's identity is completely gone. And I imagine at that moment, that dream of his brothers bowing down to him felt like the farthest thing away from him. And maybe for some of us, we thought, well, at least my family knows that I'm alive. At least they're praying for me. But his brothers didn't care about him, and his dad thought he was dead because his brothers lied to his dad. And so he was killed by animals. And for Joseph, there's no hope in this moment. And so we're going to pick it up in chapter 39, because I think there's some things that God is promising us if we are diligent to remain patient in suffering. And that those things in our life are really God setting us up for the promise that he gave us. Because sometimes if we jump into that promise too early, we're just going to mess it up. And we got to go through some stuff in our life so we don't mishandle the promise that God has for us. Joseph was arrogant. He lacked self-control. He lacked humility. And a whole mess of other things that God needed him to have in his life to be able to step into the things that God was calling him to do. Because the promises that God had for him weren't just about him. So if we back up to that story, when he's talking to his brothers, his focus in that story is himself. That I'm here to get the glory, that I'm here to get the attention, and it's all about me. But when God shows up and gets Joseph to the point of the promise, it becomes about saving his family and saving a nation. And so in chapter 39, we'll read this. It says, when Joseph was taken to Egypt by the Ishmaelite traders, he was purchased by Potiphar, an Egyptian officer. Potiphar was captain of the guard of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. The Lord was with Joseph, so he succeeded in everything he did as he served in the home of his Egyptian master. Verse 3, Potiphar noticed this and realized that the Lord was with Joseph, giving him success in everything he did. This pleased Potiphar, so he soon made Joseph his personal attendant. He put him in charge of the entire household and everything he owned. From the day Joseph was put in charge of his master's household and property, the Lord began to bless Potiphar's household for Joseph's sake. All his household affairs ran smoothly, and his crops and livestock flourished. So Potiphar gave Joseph complete administrative responsibilities over everything. Some of you cringed at administrative responsibilities. You're like, if that's my promise, then I'll skip that. With Joseph there, he didn't worry about a thing except what kind of food to eat. Now, some of you are like, I can deal with that. How many of you would love to be like, my only concern is, do I get Whataburger or do I get Chick-fil-A? It's Sunday, you're getting Whataburger. Let me help you out. And we're gonna kind of skip through this. The next part here just talks about Joseph and Potiphar's wife. Potiphar's wife liked Joseph a lot. And wanted to get interesting with him. And constantly pursued him. And was like, hey, Joseph, come sleep with me. Joseph's like, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to go against my master, Potiphar, and I'm not going to go against my king, my God. And she kept pursuing him to the point where they're caught in a moment where Joseph and her are the only ones in the house. For some of you, got to make sure that you're not the only ones in the house with somebody that's crazy. And she grabs a hold of Joseph, grabs a hold of his coat, and Joseph's like, I'm not staying here for this, runs out and leaves his coat. And Potiphar's wife uses that coat to say that Joseph tried to rape me, and tells that to her husband, and her husband's furious, throws Joseph in jail. So Joseph's journey is slavery to jail. How many of you guys would sign up for that track? We're going to start a small group next week called Slavery to Jail. All of you have to attend. So we skip down to verse 19. It says this: Potiphar was furious when he heard his wife's story about how Joseph had treated her false story. And so he took Joseph and threw him into the prison where the king's prisoners were held. And there he remained. But the Lord was with Joseph in the prison and showed him his faithful love. And the Lord made Joseph a favorite with the prison warden. Before long, the warden put Joseph in charge of all the other prisoners, over everything that happened in the prison. The warden had no more worries because Joseph took care of everything. The Lord was with him and caused everything he did to succeed. So we're going to pause there a moment. We're going to continue on the rest of it in a little bit, but I want to pull out some things in chapter 39 that I think God wants to talk to us this morning about. If we remain patient in suffering, these are some things that are going to begin to develop in our life. And if we look at verse 2 and 21, we see that in the midst of slavery and in the midst of the prison, Joseph experienced God's presence. The time of suffering and struggle in our life can lead us to a point where we have proximity to Jesus. Now listen, we live in a time where there's so many other things that we can turn to. It's easy for us to get up and get online and say, I'm just going to talk about the things that I'm going through and maybe somebody will make me feel better about myself. The problem is that lasts about 2 seconds. But our proximity to God gives us endurance to go the distance. Nothing outside of that will. It might give us a short burst of energy, but it's not going to give us the endurance to make it all the way through. Not only that, in verse 21, it tells us that Joseph, let me read it to you again. It says, but the Lord was with Joseph. There's that proximity in the prison. And it showed him and showed him his faithful love. God showed up in the midst of the jail and showed Joseph that he was present, that he loved him, and that he was faithful. I'm thankful for a God that is real and willing to step into the mess and the struggle that we're in so we don't have to go through it alone. God promises that he won't leave us and he won't forsake us. He doesn't promise that life is going to be easy, and he doesn't promise that we're not going to go through struggles. In fact, there's a lot of times in the Bible, if you read it, he's putting us in the midst of the struggle to get us somewhere. One of my other favorite stories in the Bible is the disciples in the boat, and they're struggling against the wave. And the reason Jesus put them in there is to get to the other side because there's something they had to do on the other side. God will put us in the midst of struggle and difficulty and suffering in our life to get us somewhere. But he doesn't leave us alone to do it. Even when the disciples are in the boat and Jesus went off to pray, Jesus still showed up in that boat in the midst of the struggle. God, in a prison and in slavery, showed himself to be faithful, to be present, and to be a loving God. Not only that, he gave Joseph favor. He gave Joseph favor with Potiphar. He gave Joseph favor with the warden. If you're in a situation of struggle, and I'm just going to use work as an analogy, you're in a situation of struggle at work, you feel like you're doing your job, and it doesn't seem like anybody notices. It could be that God's trying to get your attention and trying to work something in your life. I was thinking about this morning. There have been times in my life where I've had a job and there's been something going on. It could be a whole host of different things, and I just felt unseen, and I felt like I was struggling in my job. And I was reading this morning. There were moments where I just got irritated with that and said, God, I'm done. And I missed the opportunity to grow in endurance. And so guess what? I had to repeat that. There are no short steps. There's no shortcuts to endurance. You either do the work or you're not going to make it. And God's more concerned about us making it, so he's going to keep putting us in that situation to keep experiencing that struggle. I don't know if that's happened to anybody else. It's happened to me more than I want to admit. So God put him in a situation, in his willingness to be patient in the struggle, gave him favor with the people that were around him. Not only that, it gave him position. In the midst of some of the lowest situations you could be in your life, Joseph found positions of God putting him up above in an authority and leadership. So in the midst of the jail, in the midst of slavery, Joseph finds God putting himself in places of leadership because, again, God had some things for Joseph to learn so that when he got to his dream, when he got to his calling, when he got to the promise that God had for him for his life, that he was ready to step into the leadership and the authority that he needed. So sometimes we can find ourselves in what seems like insignificant situations. And if we're conscious of what God's doing in our life, we'll be looking for the opportunities, the position that God's give us, even if they seem insignificant. I mean, really being charged in a bunch of prisoners, who cares? I mean, nobody puts that on their job application, right? But Joseph took those opportunities very seriously, and he worked diligently and hard to learn and to step into the things that God was calling to him, even if it seemed insignificant. And then God begins to bless Joseph's life, even in the midst of struggle and difficulty. And not only that, he began to bless those that were around Joseph. If we go back and we look at Potiphar, his whole household began to be blessed because of Joseph's willingness to patiently remain in suffering. So much so that Potiphar, a man who would have very little context of who the God of the Bible, the God of the Hebrews, the God of Joseph would be, recognized that God was with Joseph. God's ability to bless you in the midst of your struggle is a testimony to those around you that God is real and that God is doing something in your life and can do something in their life. So sometimes God puts us in the midst of struggle and suffering so that others can see who he is. It's his opportunity to call others to him through you. And the last thing we kind of get out of this one section of the story is that while Joseph's there, he's gaining experience that he's going to need to step in to the palace. While he's a slave, he's learning how to manage resources and manage a business. And we're going to see in a little bit why that's important. While he's in jail, he's learning to lead people. And then here in just a little bit, while he's in jail, he learns to how to interpret dreams. Because he missed it when he was 17. When God gave him his dreams of his brothers bowing down to him, he missed what that dream was all about. He thought it was all about him. But if we continue in verse 40, or in chapter 40, what happens is these two guys get thrown into the jail. One is the king's cupbearer, so he's at the king's side every time they sit down to a meal, or every time something is brought to the king for him to drink. The cupbearer gets to taste it first and make sure it's not poison. I want to sign up for that job. You better be praying that your king is well-liked, right? Like if nobody liked the king, I'm like, nope, I'm not doing that job. Just go ahead and kill me now. But Joseph, or the cupbearer, is thrown into jail because somehow he made the king mad. Doesn't tell us how he made the king mad. And so he's in jail. And then the chief baker, God makes all the food. I don't know. Maybe he messed up his caramel macchiato. I don't know. But he messed something up. And he's in jail as well. And they're in there, and they're put under Joseph. And one night, both of them have dreams. And Joseph comes in the next morning and sees them and sees that they are in distress. And he asks them, hey, what's wrong with you guys? I mean, I get you're in jail. That's probably a good place to start. But it's more than normal. What is up? And they begin to tell him these dreams. And Joseph says, hey, it's God's deal. God will tell you what the dreams are. But tell me what they are, and we'll figure this out together. And basically what happens is the cupbearer has a dream that he's going to be restored back to his position with the king. And the baker has a dream that he's basically going to be executed. I definitely want the first dream, not the second dream. And then it happens. And see, because Joseph waited on God and began to have a relationship with God. See, back before, it doesn't really talk about Joseph's relationship with God. It just talks about the dream that he had and his ability to share that with everybody else. But through the course of him getting to know God and being able to see God's faithfulness and God's love in his life, when it comes to the second round of dreams, he's like, hey, let's stop and let's ask God what these dreams are about. And because he goes to God, he gets it right. He tells the cupbearer, hey, when you go back to Pharaoh, remember me because I'm really not supposed to be in here. So he learned how to manage resources. He learned how to lead people, and he learned how to interpret dreams, which was going to be important to get him to the dream that God had given him, get him to the place that God was calling him to go, get him to the place where he was going to have probably the single most importance in saving an entire generation of people. And so if we keep going into chapter 41, we start to get to the promise that God has for Joseph. So what happens from there is the cupbearer is restored back to his service with the king and completely forgets about Joseph. Sometimes it feels like that happens. You're doing everything, you're trying to do everything right, and it feels like nobody sees you. It feels like it's just forgotten and it's of no consequences. And we really don't hear much about Joseph between the time the cupbearer leaves and what happens next. And what happens next is that the Pharaoh has two dreams. The first dream is that he sees 7 fat, awesome-looking cows that are going to make great steak. And then he sees 7 scrawny, ugly-looking cows that eat the 7 healthy, fat cows. So he wakes up from that. He's distraught. He goes back to sleep. Has the same dream again, but this time with heads of grain. And so he sees 7 awesome, beautiful, full heads of grain. And then he sees 7 ugly, dried, shriveled up, nasty-looking heads of grain that eat the good heads of grain. And so Pharaoh wakes up, doesn't understand what any of this means, but he knows it's significant. So he gets his wise men together, his magicians, anybody that he felt like could tell him what that dream meant, and they know nothing. They literally say, Pharaoh, you're crazy. There's no way that anybody can know what these things mean. Just so happens the cupbearer is standing there. He's like, oh, hey, I think I might know a guy. Yeah, it only took a while for him to remember that. And so it is Joseph. They go and get Joseph out of prison. They clean him up a little bit. The Bible actually says that. He gets cleaned up a little bit, changes his clothes, shaves, takes a shower. And they bring him before Pharaoh. And Pharaoh tells his dreams to Joseph. In verse 16 of chapter 41, it says this. Pharaoh has told the dreams to Joseph, and Joseph says this: "It's beyond my power to do this, Joseph." Or Joseph replied, "But God can tell you what it means and set you at ease." One thing that Joseph got in his time in slavery and his time in the jail was some humility. The first dreams that he had, he went to his brothers and said, "Let me tell you what this means." By the time he gets to Pharaoh, he's like, "I don't know anything, but God does. So he's going to tell you what they mean. I'm just here to be the words." Joseph figured out that it's not about him, but it's all about God. So he begins to tell Pharaoh what's going to happen, that they're going to have 7 years of amazing abundance. There's going to be so much grain, so much food, that it's going to be running out of every place that they try to put it. So much so that we keep reading the story, Joseph just stops counting at some point. He's like, "There's way too much. I'm not even going to keep track." But then 7 years of severe famine and drought are going to come that are going to eclipse, totally wipe away the 7 good years. And Joseph goes on in wisdom and says, "Hey, you need to get somebody in place and in charge that can manage the resources that are going to come in so that we're not destroyed in the time when we don't have anything." And he doesn't take that opportunity to plug himself. He says, "Find somebody. Whoever it is, find somebody that's going to do a good job managing this so we can make it through." Just more evidence of Joseph's humility. And it's not about me. It's about God continuing his plan. And we get to verse 32. And so Joseph's explaining all this stuff. And this is something that I've kind of just read over in the past. I read this story a lot. Like I said, it's one of my favorites. And I never really saw this until this time as I was preparing for this message today. Verse 32, Joseph has explained everything. He says, "As for having two similar dreams, it means that these events have been decreed by God and he will soon make them happen." You guys remember another time that God gave somebody two dreams? 17 years ago, when Joseph had two dreams that he was going to be in a place of authority. Now, for 17 years, he's been living as a slave and living in the jail. And even now that he's standing before Pharaoh, there's no promise of anything except going back to the jail. But something has happened to Joseph in that time of suffering and struggle, in that time of being close to God and seeing God's faithfulness and love, is that his faith increased. Our time of struggle and suffering can be a time for our faith to increase, that God is going to do what he says he's going to do. So much so that Joseph said, "Hey, you had that dream twice. That means that God's going to do it and he's going to do it soon." And I can't help but wonder if Joseph in that moment, if he's thinking back to those dreams that he had out in the wilderness of Sinai, that God was going to put him in a position of authority. I wonder if Joseph was like, "God, not only do I remember that for the Pharaoh, but God, I remember that promise that you gave to me." Again, Joseph has no promise of going anywhere but back to prison. But then in verse 37 through 46, we begin to see the fulfillment of God's promise in Joseph's life. Pharaoh says, "You're the only one who has any clue about what is happening. So we want you to be in charge. In fact, you know what? I'm going to make you the second most powerful man in the world. The only person who's going to have more authority and more power than you is me. In fact, I'm going to give you my signet ring so you don't even have to come and check with me. I trust you that you can manage all of our resources, you can manage all of our people, and you can do the things that we need done so that we will survive. See, Joseph thought God's plan was all about him being important. And really what God's plan was to save a generation that included the seed for Jesus. God used the struggle and the difficulty of Joseph's life to continue the story of Jesus, to continue the promise that God had given to us in the garden, that even though we messed up God's plan, that God had a plan and a way for salvation. And that was going to come through Jesus, who was going to come from the line of Jacob. And Joseph had a hand in that. And so what happens is they go through the 7 years of abundance, and Joseph helps save up everything that they need to save up. They take a fifth of everything that's produced, they store it up, so much so that, like Joseph, like I said, he quits counting. Just keep storing it up. We'll figure it out later. And then during the 7 years of famine, his family, his brothers and his dad and his stepmoms, or whatever you want to call them, are still living in Canaan, and they are in fear of dying from starvation. And so Jacob's like, hey, I hear they have some grain in Egypt. Why don't you go get some? And we begin this story of reconciliation between Joseph and his brothers and his dad and his entire family. Sometimes the struggle and suffering that we're going through in our life is so that God can work reconciliation between us and somebody that we're at odds with. And listen, I know in the midst of the struggle, in the midst of the suffering, it's hard. And it would be easy to say, God, just get me out of this, whatever it takes. Can we just go around this? Can we get out of it? Can we not have to go through this moment? And I think a lot of times God's like, we have to get through this moment to get where I need you to be. Joseph had to go through slavery and through the jail to get where God needed him to be. He even acknowledges that with his brothers. Because his brothers came to him once they realized it was Joseph, they thought they were done. I mean, this is the second most powerful guy in the world. It would be easy for him to take vengeance. And that's what his brothers were expecting. But another thing that God worked in Joseph's life was the ability to forgive his brothers. And so Joseph said, look, I'm not holding this against you. In fact, what you thought you were doing out of your own heart and out of evil, God actually had a plan in that. You may not have the right intentions in the things that you did, but God had a plan to get me to this point. And this point includes the forgiveness between you and I. The struggle and the suffering that we go through can bring us back into relationship with people that we've lost it with. Sometimes it brings us back into relationship with God when we've walked away. Not only that, because of Joseph's faithfulness and consistency and willingness to endure suffering, his entire family is blessed, and they are brought into the kingdom. And basically, Pharaoh says, give them whatever they want. Take whatever land you want. because of your faithfulness, your family is going to be blessed. So this morning, I just want to wrap up very simply. If everybody will stand to their feet. If you're in this room this morning and you would say, man, I'm going through a season of struggle and suffering in my life. And it could be whatever. It could be that you're struggling with reconciliation with somebody. At some point, there's been enmity between you and somebody else. There's been struggle with you and somebody else, and you're wanting God to reconcile that relationship. It could be that you're going through a difficult time at work. And if you're honest, you're to the point where you're like, I really just want to give up and go find something else. And God is saying, just hold on. Don't quit. Don't leave yet. My promise is on the other end of the struggle. And it could be a whole host of things, but you just know that you're in the midst of struggle and you need some encouragement this morning. So if that's you, I'm just going to ask you to raise your hand. I know that's kind of an intimidating thing to do, to say, man, I'm going through it and I need somebody to help. And so if you look around, if you see somebody with their hand raised, if you'll just reach your arm out to them, if you're standing next to them, if you'll just place your hand on their shoulder, we're going to pray for those. The truth is probably most of us have something in our life that we are struggling through right now. And so we're just going to pray. God, I thank you, number one, that in the midst of struggle and suffering, that you promise not to leave us. That instead, God, you step into our struggle, into our suffering. You get in the middle of the mess with us. You're beside us. And God, you are faithful to show us your love, your mercy, your grace, and to show us your faithfulness. God, I pray that in the midst of the struggle, God, that you would remind us of the promises that you've made in our life. That God, on the other end of this, there's your promise. God, I pray that you give us the courage to stay. Give us the courage to remain in the difficulty with patience. God, that we're not like the Israelites and grumbling, complaining the entire time, but we're like Joseph, and we're going to give it everything we got, no matter what our position is. No matter if there's fame on the other end or if we stay right where we are. God, we thank you for those moments in our life where we're learning who you are in our life, and who you've created us to be. God, and I pray that you begin to bless the people around us so that in the midst of the struggle, God, they see you. God, it's not about us, but it's about you. God, I pray that in the midst of our struggle, that they would see you, because our attention and our focus is on you. Our hope, our faith is in you and in no other place. The government's not going to fix it. Facebook's not going to fix it. Our friends are not going to fix it. But you and you alone. God, we love you. God, I thank you for everybody in this room. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Before we leave, I just want to extend this to you. This is really a picture of who Jesus is in our life. Jesus came and endured the cross until it was finished. Hanging on the cross, he said, "It's finished. I have satisfied God's wrath on sin. I've satisfied God's wrath towards you. And it's done. It's finished. And you are forgiven." And on the other side of the cross is God's promise of life and restoration. Jesus died, but he was restored back to life. And that's the promise that God has for us, that through the cross, it's finished and that life waits for us. And so if you're in this room and you don't know what it's like to be on the other side of the cross, to experience life and restoration, we want to have a conversation with you. And our prayer team is going to be up here to pray with you and talk more with you about that. And Jesus said, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. You can't find that promise through anything else except through me. And so if that's you, I want to invite you to come up as everybody is making their way out and just talk with one of our leaders and pray with them. And so I want to thank everybody for coming out this morning. We love you. We are so excited you are here. Have a great Sunday, and we will see you guys next week. Thank you for coming.